All right, welcome. I'm John, a 24-year resident and techie here in San Francisco. I'm sorry. Like many techies, I wasn't too involved in politics or civic society until this year, and I think I speak for a lot of my friends and neighbors when I say this year feels like a tipping point moment. We're overly alarmed at the crime, the homelessness, the drug addiction, the dealers, and the amount of money we're spending only seems to make the problems worse. So technically, I guess we're not overly alarmed. What I wanted to do is find one of the more informed locals I know on this subject, Thomas Wolfe, and ask him some of the burning questions that many of us have, but maybe social media and some of our politicians can't seem to answer. I have no agenda, no corporate or commercial motivations. I really love San Francisco. I've decided to stay and fight for it, along with my amazing wife. And I just wanted to find a domain expert who lived through these crises and get their thoughts. Thomas is a father of two, husband, homeowner, but fell into an opioid addiction and ended up homeless in the Tenderloin district of San Francisco. Today, he's a case manager at the Salvation Army's San Francisco office and serves on San Francisco City's new street level drug dealing task force. So Thomas, thank you so much for taking the time. Tell us about yourself, and let's just get the obvious question out of the way. You're a good-looking, smart, articulate dude. How did you end up on the streets?
Wow. Well, it's kind of a fascinating story, really. So, you hear this in the news a lot about people getting addicted to opioids because of surgery, and that's exactly what happened to me. I was just, pretty much your regular middle-class guy, San Francisco native, born and raised here. Like you said, married with two kids, homeowner, had a county job. I worked for the city and county of San Francisco for 9 years as a child support officer. And in early 2015, I had surgery on my foot. And coming out of surgery, they prescribed to me oxycodone, 10 milligram oxycodone pills. And, some people's addiction manifest with alcohol, some with other drugs. With me, it was with opium or opiates, opioids, whatever you want to call it. As soon as I took that first pill, I got this real just euphoric feeling that overtook me, along with it taking away the pain. And I just started abusing it at that point. And it didn't take long. It took basically one refill after the initial dose, and then I was popping them like candy and just chewing them up in my mouth, eating 2 or 3 at a time. So it progressed very quickly into an addiction. And then when I ran out of that script, I went back to my doctor. They wouldn't give me another refill, and I went into withdrawal. And for anyone that's ever been addicted to heroin or opioids of any kind, the withdrawals are absolutely horrible. It's like having the flu times 10. And I couldn't take it anymore, so I needed to figure out where I could get those pills. I actually looked it up on YouTube, where I could buy drugs and pills on the streets in San Francisco. And I found a YouTube page, and it told me to go to Pill Hill, which is Golden Gate and Leavenworth streets in the Tenderloin. And I proceeded to go there. And sure enough, I found what I was looking for, and I started purchasing 30 milligram tablets of roxicodone, which is kind of a rapid release oxycodone. And I just kind of was off to the races from there. The addiction progressed over the course of several years until I had a tolerance close to 600 milligrams a day of oxycodone. So if you took 600 milligrams right now, John, that would kill you right out the bat. It would kill you. It would stop your heart and you would die. But my tolerance had gone up so high that I was taking, 7 to 8 80 milligram tablets of oxycodone daily that I was buying from one dealer that I found on the street out there at $30 to $35 a pill. So you do the math. Over the course of about 3.5 to 4 years, I spent well over $100,000, probably closer to $150,000 just on those pills alone. And I made the decision to switch to heroin because, my wife was obviously finding out about all these things. I had, fallen behind on the mortgage payments. I was missing a lot of work. Bills weren't getting paid. So she started to kind of, figure it out because I couldn't hide the debt anymore that I was ringing up from all these pills. And she started to kind of cut me off from the money. So it really became an economic decision at that point to switch to heroin, because heroin's only $10 for a dime of heroin is what they call it. And that's a little ball that's wrapped in plastic that you can either smoke or you can inject intravenously, and that would, take care of the withdrawals and continue to get you high kind of situation. So I literally walked 1 block over to Golden Gate and Hyde, and I bought my first dime of heroin. That was in early 2017, and then I was kind of off to the races from there, and started using heroin intravenously. I actually gave myself sepsis from injecting heroin because I would miss the vein sometimes and shoot into the muscle, and that would abscess, and eventually gave myself a blood infection, and I nearly died. I ended up in the hospital. And for most people, you would think that would have been a wake-up call to stop, but it wasn't for me. I just switched to smoking heroin at that point from shooting it up. Long story short, what ended up happening is that one night I snuck out of the house to go buy some heroin, took the car, drove down to the Tenderloin, and I didn't go home for 11 days straight.
Oh.
I went on an 11-day bender in the Tenderloin. And, my wife was, of course, freaking out. My kids were freaking out. They didn't understand what was going on. And it wasn't until my wife filed a missing persons report on me that the police found me out there after 11 days, and they sent me home. I got home, and my wife was waiting for me with a bag packed saying either you need to go to rehab or you need to get out. And at that very moment, I was in full withdrawal from heroin. And so the choice really at that point, I was so deep into my addiction, the choice was easy for me, and I chose to leave. And shortly after that, my wife placed a restraining order on me. So then I was officially homeless at that point because I could not go home. Right. And I spent the next 6 months in the Tenderloin, homeless on the streets, literally sleeping on a piece of cardboard in a doorway, doing drugs. Yeah.
One of my friends once said to me about this topic, a homeless person hasn't spent their last dollar, John. They've spent their last relationship. And listening to your powerful story just really reminds me of that. Let me ask you, I could be very wrong here because it's just my pedestrian observation. And again, the whole point of me doing this is to learn. I don't have all the answers by any means, and I would love for other people to correct me or teach me. But my pedestrian observation is it seems like San Francisco has created the perfect ecosystem to be a drug addict. How did SF help you get clean? And were there job or education services offered as incentives to get clean?
So that's a great question. So I'll say, what I will say is that in the 6 months that I spent on the street, I encountered one form of outreach from a nonprofit organization. And that was a nonprofit organization that was handing out what they called drug kits to users on the street. And it was a Ziploc bag that had a clean syringe, it had cotton balls, it had other paraphernalia for cooking and using heroin intravenously, Brillo, which is the scrubbing pads for kitchen pads that you use to clean pots and pans, because you can cut pieces of that off and use that as a screen in your glass pipe to smoke crack or meth.
I did not know that.
So yeah, so they were handing all that out, and that was the only interaction I had with a nonprofit or an outreach type of organization from the city or nonprofit or otherwise, other than the police. So I had multiple interactions with the police, as they are the primary source of outreach in San Francisco. As far as being offered any type of, hey, you want to go to rehab or need a job training or do you need help with anything? I didn't get any of that when I was out there. And to be quite frank, I didn't want any of it when I was out there because I was so deep in my addiction. Really, I just wanted to be alone. As you may know, the addiction, a big part of addiction is isolation. So I wanted to be alone with my drugs. So if someone had come up to me anyway and said, hey, do you have a drug problem? Do you need help? My answer would have probably been no, go away, leave me alone, to be quite frank. So I had the help in my situation kind of forced upon me because of various factors that landed me in hot water with law enforcement.
Here in San Francisco, we have two, not constant, but consistent things, which is fog and censorship. And, personally, I love the fog. One of the words that seems not forbidden, but maybe a little dangerous to say out loud in a crowded place, is the phrase the homeless industrial complex. I mean, how is it that we spend so much and get so little results? And to be fair, this isn't just San Francisco. This is throughout California, LA, and we see it in San Diego too. I think President Eisenhower in 60 or 61 was warning Americans about the military industrial complex. Do you think there is a homeless industrial complex in that the system with all the money that goes through it is enriching a lot of people, and so you have some folks that are protective of it? Like,
Well, it's a tough question, and there's you have to be really careful. I'm going to try to be as careful as I can to answer this question, kind of down the middle as possible. Okay,
it's a dangerous question. I understand.
It is. So okay, so you have thousands of nonprofits in California, and the primary objective of many of those nonprofits is to help the homeless, right? And those nonprofits are all, striving to reduce homelessness by either creating more affordable housing, more permanent supportive housing, drug rehabilitation, job training, all of those different things. The problem is that with all these different thousands of nonprofits, they're all working towards the same goals, but differently. There's not one uniform type of model that they're following, other than the fact that there's a need for more affordable housing in California. That seems to kind of be like the underlying issue that everybody sort of kind of agrees upon. As far as how each of those nonprofits implements their programs, though, that's up to each nonprofit. And what gets confusing about that is that you have in San Francisco, you have hundreds of nonprofits, and hundreds of nonprofits also have contracts with the city, and they receive city money, our taxpayer dollars that through the city budget, and they sign these contracts with these nonprofits to provide services. And I think the concern there is oversight with that money, and then the results of said contracts and how they play out in that. Are you really showing the results of creating more housing opportunities, more drug treatment opportunities? Are you really reducing the homeless population? And I think it's pretty clear that the answer is no. With the amount of money that we're spending in California and in San Francisco alone, the homeless problem has just increased year over year over year for at least the last 10 years. The population has increased. And so I think what needs to happen here is that I think there needs to be a little more financial oversight in that any nonprofit that chooses to do business with the city, or vice versa, where the city chooses to do business with them, that there needs to be an annual audit that's done. From what I understand, the last audit that was done in San Francisco of all the nonprofits was in 2016. So that's almost 5 years now since there's been an audit done.
Wow.
So, that would raise some pretty serious concerns. If you're a business owner and you're investing $1 billion a year to see results in your product, and you're actually going in the negative direction, what do? You retool, you do something different to try to achieve that goal. Or maybe you clean house, or maybe you go to another entity to try to help you achieve that goal. That's not happening in San Francisco and in California. We're giving money to the same programs, the same nonprofits year after year after year, expecting the same result, or expecting a better result, and we're getting negative results from that. And that's not completely their fault. I mean, the fact of the matter is that there's more people entering homelessness every year, and you have to think about what's driving that. So if I were going to take that $1 billion, I would think about other ways to invest it, and kind of maybe treat this a little bit more like if you were running a business, a corporation. Because what ends up happening is that you get these nonprofits that end up becoming dependent on those contracts to continue operating, because they want to do good. Their intentions are good, but you've heard the term that the road to hell is paved with good intentions, and that's kind of what we're running into here in San Francisco.
And that road to hell ends in San Francisco. Well, and it begs the question: we don't even spend $1 billion a year on our public school system.
Right.
And have chased a lot of good families with great kids outside of the city because of that. I guess let me ask the white elephant in the room question. Is it about homelessness or housing, or is it about addiction and law enforcement?
All of the above. So that's my official answer. Is it's true. It's all of the above. There, and I want to make some distinctions about housing. And you hear the term affordable housing get thrown around a lot. Okay, but there's another term called permanent supportive housing. Permanent supportive housing and affordable housing are two different things. Okay, affordable housing is when you build a condo complex and you say 30% of these units are affordable housing. That means that maybe a single mom with a couple of kids that has an $80,000 a year job is going to be able to qualify to get a reduced rate mortgage that has a lower interest rate and a lower down payment so they can get her and her family into home ownership. Okay. Permanent supportive housing is when someone is on SSI as an example, or is homeless as an example, and they go to the city for help and they do qualify for housing and they get placed into an SRO, which is a converted hotel usually, or it's an old apartment building that the city bought and converted into supportive housing. And what that is that's that's a situation where you're paying 30% GMI, your gross monthly income, as your rent. The city subsidizes the rest of your rent and then also pays for wraparound services for you to have available to you as you live in that SRO or in that facility. And those wraparound services are case management, sometimes harm reduction services, sometimes job training, sometimes access to mental health services. It's a variety of different things, and the city pays for all of that. So those are two different things. And in San Francisco right now, we have over 11,000 people in permanent supportive housing at a cost of $30,000 per person per year. Once they're housed, okay? That doesn't include the cost of actually building new housing. So I just wanted to really separate those two for people that don't know. Affordable housing is one thing, permanent supportive housing is another thing underneath that permanent supportive housing umbrella. And then to answer your original question about drug addiction is, to me, and in my experience, one of the main drivers of homelessness in San Francisco. When I was homeless on the street, 8 out of 10 people, I think I said 85% in a documentary I did a couple of months ago, of the people I encountered when I was on the street were struggling with addiction. Does that mean that everybody's struggling with addiction? No, because you have young moms that are maybe couch surfing with their kids. You have young adults that are maybe couch surfing or living in their cars that aren't necessarily struggling with addiction. But the people that are visible, that we see living in tents, that are just out in the middle of the street, just laid out in the middle of the street, yeah, those folks are all struggling pretty much with drug addiction. And whether they became homeless like I did because of drug addiction, or they turn to drugs once they become homeless on the street, the end result is the same. You're addicted to drugs at that point. And the only way you can improve your quality of life, truly improve your quality of life, is to work towards, overcoming that addiction. Now, you can house somebody that has an addiction, and that's the whole model of Housing First. And that's a federal model to lower barriers to housing by placing someone with either low barrier or no preconditions at all into housing. And if you move the goalposts all the way back to that point of the difference between being on the street and being housed is a victory, then yes, that works, okay? But what happens after that is really, really critical, because if they continue to maintain their addiction while they're housed, then their quality of life never really improves past that point, past that baseline right there. And that's one of the things that I advocate for, is to try to improve those situations, to try to offer more support for what happens after, let's say, someone comes out of a drug rehab. Where can they go? What kind of support do they have? Or when someone does get housed that's struggling with drug addiction, what type of support system is in place to help them address their addiction issues? And San Francisco, in my humble opinion, is falling very, very short in that area, because when you go down to the Tenderloin and you see all the SRO hotels down there and all the people that are housed down there, I've worked in those hotels. I've been inside. It's not fair for me to say almost everyone, but almost everyone that I've seen that are in those hotels are using. And it's weird. Some hotels do better than others. Some of those SROs are doing better than others. They have less people using. But there's some SROs where you have 60, 70 residents and all 60 or 70 of them are using drugs. And so it just, creates a problem where you have people overdosing inside those buildings and dying. A lot of overdoses happen indoors in San Francisco. And that's because that root issue of addiction is not being addressed at the level that it needs to be addressed at.
And I think with the amount of money that we're spending, and I think all people, or certainly most people, agree that all lives are precious, but at the cost of a private university to house every person, I think a lot of people are asking, do they need to be housed in $800 a square foot real estate, or in places of retail or schools or pedestrian heavy zones? Again, it's a prickly issue, and there's no easy answers we're going to come up with today on that. But I do think one of the other questions that comes up a lot is, where does the money go in terms of the incentives versus services? Are you seeing more investment towards offering services that incentivize folks to get clean?
Well, that's one of the issues that I'm advocating for, and that I'm running into difficulty in kind of processing here in San Francisco. So one of the big pushes that I do is I try to push to promote treatment in San Francisco. Right now, San Francisco has 503 treatment beds that are sanctioned by the Department of Public Health, and then another 300 treatment beds that are abstinence-based in San Francisco that are privately funded. And when I was on the street, I certainly did not know where to go to get help to get into drug treatment. There needs to be both, high technology and low technology promotion of treatment in San Francisco. And that just basically, there isn't enough of that going around. So if you're on the street and you're ready to get clean, it's not so easy to find the resources to actually do that. Compound that with the fact that once you start that process, it can take a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks for you to be assessed and meet with a case manager and then determine even if they have space for you, because treatment is currently patient-centered in San Francisco. And you might be familiar with that term, like with cancer patients. You get diagnosed with cancer and your doctor sits down with you and says, okay, you have cancer. Here are your treatment options. We can give you chemo, we can give you radiation, you can do this, you can do that. And you tell us what you want to do. Well, drug addiction is probably the most selfish disease in existence, okay? So if you sit down with someone and they say, well, here's your treatment options. You can just have harm reduction therapy outpatient over here, or you can do a program where you just use less and wean off over time, or you can go to an abstinence-based program over here where you have to let it all go. Which one, when you're struggling with heroin addiction or fentanyl addiction, are you going to choose? You're going to choose the easiest, most selfish, most beneficial option for you, right? So when you really drill down into the treatment modalities in San Francisco and how it's done, it's kind of nuts, because no one's ever going to go to treatment and no one's ever going to get better if you give an addict all these choices on how they want to get well. When I finally made that decision, when I was sitting in county jail and I had lost everything and I had an opportunity to go to rehab, I would have gone to a rehab in the middle of the Sahara Desert if that's what it took for me to get clean and have any kind of chance of even seeing my kids again. And that's the thing about addiction, is that when you're ready to kind of give up and surrender to the process of recovery, you should be willing to do whatever it takes. And I know that's not the most popular view right now in San Francisco among harm reductionists and whatnot. And I think that lends to the problem of why there's so many people out there struggling on the street. We're spending all our money on keeping people alive, on the baseline of keeping people alive, giving out Narcan to everybody, giving out clean needles to everybody. And now they're giving out pieces of aluminum foil to everybody, and straws to everybody, and glass pipes to everybody. And you're saying, here, if you're going to use safely, don't get hepatitis and don't kill yourself, stay alive, but just stay right there.
I
That's
was
kind
I was shocked to see that San Francisco had paid for a billboard saying, if you're going to do dangerous drugs, do it with friends. And remember, we give you free Narcan. And the photo of the models they used, like together, like having a grand old time. I just, for some reason, I understand their intentions were good, but it was really deeply disturbing to me to see that as I was driving my car.
the
Um,
problem with that is the imagery. It's you're right, the imagery, the drug party. It blurs the line between harm reduction and drug promotion. And then ironically they did another one, and they showed some people that were some street people in the background that looked like they were all getting together, getting ready to use. And what they didn't know is that one of the people in that picture is a well-known fentanyl dealer in San Francisco. So they didn't do their homework either.
mhm.
Yeah, it was crazy, and I'm glad they took those signs down.
I moved to San Francisco during the Willie Brown and Herb Caen era, the great Herb Caen, and just fell in love with San Francisco. And when London Breed became mayor, I was thrilled. Not that I think Breed and Brown are incredible people, um, but I thought that, you know, Mayor Brown had come from this traditional philosophy of local leadership, which said you got to give citizens great access to capital and opportunity, small, big business alike. And you got to keep the streets safe and clean for tourism. And when London Breed became mayor, I thought, wow, she's going to make it happen, you know. But as I educated myself more about how power is managed in City Hall, I began to learn that a mayor can only do so much without the Board of Supervisors. And this is not an endorsement for London Breed. I don't know who I'm going to vote for next. But um, for those that don't know, the San Francisco Board of Supervisors is a board of elected officials from each of the local neighborhoods. And San Francisco is divvied up into these wonderful, beautiful, nuanced neighborhoods, which makes our city fantastic. But it can also be a bit of a political quagmire at times. If you were in this magical world of tomorrow, both the mayor and the president of the board of supervisors, what are some quick 1-2 punch things that you could do to reduce the amount of overdose deaths? I mean, this year, I think it's going to be close, but when 2020 ends, I think we're going to have slightly more deaths from coronary heart disease and COVID. We're going to have more overdose deaths than COVID and coronary heart disease combined, right? Or it's going to be neck and neck as 2020 closes. But it's a tragic epidemic of sorts. What could you do? Would there be some quick things that you could do if you had kind of sway of City Hall?
Sure. Well, I would also need the sway of the district attorney's office too, to really make some.
Well, so that would be my other question, right? Which is again the white elephant question. Our DA, while I believe he's a good and well-intentioned human being, I think he has a philosophy of, I mean, maybe more than a philosophy. He doesn't prosecute drug dealers, and it looks like a lot of other types of criminals. That's a separate issue, but what would cooperation from a future DA's office look like?
Well, one of the things that they need to look at is something called target specific enforcement. And what that means, and before I get into that, the district attorney talks about how the war on drugs is a failure. And I understand why he says that. But his policy, because of his own convictions, has made him so that he's not open to compromise at all. That this is his agenda, this is his narrative. He's pushing the decriminalization and the decarceration of our jails. I get it. He's elected, he's the DA. That's what he's going to try to do. But target specific enforcement, I wouldn't say so much as a war on drugs. Is what it is. It's more of breaking down the organized drug dealing that's happening in San Francisco. I posted on Twitter today a tweet explaining kind of the territory and the breakdown of the organized drug dealing in San Francisco. You know, it runs basically everything on the east side of Van Ness Avenue out all the way to Hyde Street between O'Farrell and Market Street is all controlled by organized drug dealing, by cartel-fueled organized drug dealing in San Francisco. And those guys aren't the person that's on the corner that's selling their grandmother's prescription to make rent, like some of these other people are that you see, or they're not out there slinging drugs so that they can feed their kid. They're out there organized, they're out there working together but separately. They have their drugs already prepped for them and given to them in Oakland, and they come out here and they sell, and they don't use their own product. For them, it's all business. And that ring or organization is what needs to be broken up in order for us to see a real difference, at least in the short term. Now, I know there's an argument that, oh, if you go out and arrest all those guys, that they're just going to be replaced. Well, eventually, though, if we keep doing that, we'll send a message to the higher ups that are sending these kids over here to sell that, hey, we're no longer going to tolerate that in San Francisco. And then you have a chance to turn around and say, okay, let's get these folks that are struggling with addiction into treatment, at least give them the option to get into treatment, because guess what? There's no more fentanyl on the street for you to buy. So either you go to treatment and we'll give you whatever it takes to help you kick those withdrawals from heroin or fentanyl, or you're going to go into withdrawal right here on the street. You decide what you want to do. Yeah. And I think that most of those people will say, okay, I want to get clean. Because you know what? Being a drug addict isn't fun. It's not a big party like everyone imagines it to be. When you're homeless and you're on the street, it's misery every single day. It's a hustle every single day just to survive, and just to survive enough to just get your drugs. So it's not any kind of big party like people promote it out to be. It's an absolute miserable existence that I think just even the most downtrodden person on the street understands. And if you give them some type of glimmer of hope by saying, look, we can put you inside, we can get you food, clothing, counseling, and we'll give you some kind of drug to help you get off of the current drugs that you're on, so you won't go into those withdrawals, because everybody on the street's afraid of getting dope sick. That's what they call it. I think you'll see a lot of the people on the street gravitate towards that. But the only way you can really do that is to at least reduce the drug availability on the street. Because on the corner John, I'm sorry, on the corner in the Tenderloin, if you go to Golden Gate and Hyde, it's not one guy on the street selling heroin, it's 30 guys. So that's one of the things we have to consider.
Wow. It's crazy. 30.
Yeah.
You know, we were talking about City Hall, and Tom, you know, San Francisco is an incredibly expensive city to run. By the way, these numbers aren't from me. They're from this journalist from Forbes. So I am not saying San Francisco city employees are overpaid. I've actually used the SF Fire Department. They earn every penny they make. I think they're the best fire department in the country. These numbers are from Forbes, but it is an expensive city to run. Where do you think right now the city is best spending the money? I mean, just to focus on something positive and something that's working. What's working right now where our dollars are going?
Well, I think in the short term, just in the last 6-7 months, I think our overall response to the COVID crisis has been good. It's been better than most cities. We have the lowest amount of COVID deaths here. So I think the efforts and the money that we're spending there have been well spent, in that, you know, Mayor Breed made the right call in locking us down early. It came with a subset of issues like the homeless crisis exploding and the drug crisis becoming more visible. But as far as addressing the basic issue of saving lives, I think they did a really nice job doing that. I think that the city, you know, it's hard. It's like we do focus on the negatives a lot of what's going on with San Francisco. And it's hard because San Francisco is a small city. And when you see, you know, the tourism industry take the kind of hit that it's taken in the last 7 months, you almost kind of forget about all the good things that San Francisco had going for it before this happened.
Right.
So, you know, I know one of the things that I'm looking at your presentation right here, and you're talking about how much they pay city employees, but, you know, the bottom line is that it's super expensive to live in this town too. I was making 80 grand a year. That's not a ton of money, but, you know, I was making that, and my wife was working full time, and we were just making enough to make our mortgage payment in this town. So it's tough.
Yeah.
It's tough.
And I think when people look at these numbers, in all fairness, and thank you for saying so, it's expensive to live here. $7 lattes and, $20, eggs and hash browns is normal
Right.
here. Housing costs are stratospheric. But also, I think most people, and again, this is another touchy issue about San Francisco Police Department, but in my limited experience with the SFPD and the SF Fire Department and some of our other public employees, we employ highly educated, highly professional people, and that costs money in a very, very expensive city, right? You're both a recovered addict and now a successful professional. I'm going to steal this question from the great investor Peter Thiel. What is it? What belief do you have about solving the homeless and addiction crises that a lot of people that you talk to disagree with you about? Like, what is that one kernel of truth that you're passionate about in terms of what can help solve or reduce?
So for me, the issue of mandated treatment is a big issue that I get a lot of pushback on. And here's the thing about mandated treatment, and I'll speak in general.
Touchy subject.
Touchy subject. So look, you can force anyone to get clean. You just can't force anyone to stay clean. That's the issue. So you can put someone in a controlled environment, and if you give them whatever they need to get clean, they can kick their heroin or fentanyl addiction most of the time. But it's what happens after that that's really key. What type of programs are going to be available to help that person find and stay in recovery? And then when they've completed their rehab, and that's a big thing that people don't understand, you hear about 28-day programs and 3-month programs and 6-month programs. And then people just assume that, that guy went to rehab, everything's good now. Well, for me, I went from making 80 grand a year, having credit, having a home, to being completely homeless and broke and lost everything, to the point where it took me 2 years after I got out of rehab to be able to even open a bank account. Okay. Because of all the fraud that I perpetrated in my addiction. Right. And I still haven't been able to establish credit. I'm still working on cleaning that up now. I had to, give up pretty much everything that I had and then literally rebuild from scratch. And that's not easy to do for a 50-year-old guy, to start over from scratch. Fortunately for me, I have some support that's kind of helped make that a little bit easier for me, but it's taken a lot of hard work and a lot of faith to be able to move forward each day and stay clean and sober while I'm trying to rebuild my life. And so I just think that what would help is to invest in what happens to people after they complete that treatment, after we get them clean. Maybe incentivize treatment and go to someone and say, hey, look, if you go to treatment now and you complete a 6-month program, we will help you get into 2 years of transitional housing to help you really get back on your feet. Because 28 days, 3 months, 6 months isn't necessarily enough, right? 6 months is what it took for me, but there's other people that in the rehab that I went to that had to stay there a year before they got back until they were able to build a resume and go out and get a job and save up enough money to get a place. So if we incentivize treatment, I think that can get a lot of people off the street and into housing and have them be clean at the same time. So it kind of comes back to, you can make anyone get clean, you just can't make anyone stay clean. And then there's the whole civil liberties issue on top of that. You can't just go up to somebody on the street that's high and say, we're going to pick you up and take you to rehab. You don't have a choice. Right. They have to become justice involved before you can really pick them up, right? They have to break the law before you can pick them up and say, hey, we're going to do this to you. And then that falls into another wormhole of, decriminalization and what the city's doing in regards to enforcing camping laws and encroachment laws and using drugs in public. All of those things have been virtually decriminalized in San Francisco, which kind of defeats the whole idea of mandated treatment. until you do something so bad that you get locked up. But even now, with the no bail rules that the DA has and everything, no one's staying in jail long enough to even get clean, to detox. And you have to remember, in jail in San Francisco, they do give you Suboxone to detox. When I went to county jail here, they gave me Suboxone for 5 days to help me kick my heroin addiction, the physical withdrawals. And then they tapered me off. And then I haven't touched a drug or a drink since then. And it's been almost 2.5 years.
You know, on that topic, how do we bring people together instead of this constant stream of virtue signaling, shaming, scapegoating, shouting, you know, about homelessness and addiction? It seems like we're all kind of saying the same things, and I'm guilty of saying, you know, a lot of these things on this slide. How do we all come together as San Franciscans and start to move the football down the field so we start to see cleaner, safer streets? What do you think? You're popular in social media.
First of all, I would like to see more people in recovery get involved in the decision-making process in San Francisco on driving drug policy and the harm reduction policy in San Francisco. If you talk to somebody that's currently in recovery like myself, they're going to have a very different view of drug addiction than somebody that's still in their addiction, or someone who's an expert that's never really maybe experienced addiction in their lifetime. So I think finding more people that are in recovery, and there is a recovery community here in San Francisco, and getting them more involved in the process of driving some of this policy, I think will help a lot. The other thing is that, you know, everyone's so set in their ways. Anytime you have extremism on either side, that's a negative. That's a bad thing. Look what's happening on the national level right now with all the extreme politics that are going on. Homelessness and drug addiction, to me, should be a bipartisan issue. It's a humanitarian crisis. It shouldn't be made political, but it's made political because of the virtue signaling and because there's so much money involved that it makes it political. So it's a tough question. I don't have an easy answer for it, because when you talk to certain people on one side, they're unflappable. They're not willing to compromise with you. And, so it makes it tough. It's like, I feel like sometimes I'm swimming upstream.
Yeah. You know, before I did this podcast, and again, thank you for your time. We're nearing the end, and I really wanted to do this with you. A couple of people warned me, actually more than a couple, and said, don't do this. What's the benefit? Right? It's dangerous. And, you know, I think it takes a certain amount of courage to come out and give us your viewpoint and have the courage to tell us about your experience. So thank you so much. I just take these last 7 questions from the Twitterverse. The first one is, if I can paraphrase, I guess they're asking, did decriminalization help or hurt?
I think it's hurt, and then it's created more suffering on the streets, but it's kind of a double-edged sword, because throwing someone in jail is not recovery either. So I think we need to find some type of alternative that's a little more effective, that we can send someone to quickly instead of having it take so long.
Second person is asking about the Delancey Street model, which I've heard good things about. And a lot of people are talking about this model in outside of Austin, where they have this kind of rehab camp or safe space. Do you think that would work in San Francisco?
You know, it could. So Delancey Street is a behavioral modification program. Okay, it's a rehab, but it's a behavioral modification program. It's where guys that have 2 strikes in prison go to, so they don't get the 3rd strike and go to prison for life. It's a little bit different than just some guy that's smoking fentanyl on the street that, you know, maybe is guilty of a few little petty crimes of shoplifting here and there. The program that they're running in Austin, we could do something like that, maybe on Treasure Island or maybe out by the Cow Palace. There, you know, the city owns a lot of land outside of San Francisco that they could utilize to build a community first village. It's possible. But there would have to be a lot of hurdles politically, because the current view in San Francisco is fentanyl fentanyl is not the cause of the overdose deaths. Poverty and racism is the cause of overdose deaths. And I know that that's controversial, but I'm not the one that said that. That's a quote from the Dope Project here in San Francisco. That's not me saying that.
Wow, I have no comment, but
That was their statement. That was their statement on the 441 overdose deaths in San Francisco. They said that we know, quote unquote, we know fentanyl did not kill those people, but poverty and racism did.
Right.
Unquote. So that's what I mean about no swimming upstream.
Right. And I'm not laughing to be insensitive. I don't know why I'm laughing.
No, yeah, I mean, it's incredulous, but it's serious at the same time. It's real. It's real.
Let me say a couple of other, the great comedian Lenny Bruce had this great act about words you can't say. And I think the George Carlin also kind of built on that, the great George Carlin. It seems like some of the words that are kind of hushed are the Coalition of Homeless and the Dope Project. Can you, without passing any judgment or opinions, can you tell us what are they?
So
they seem to be very powerful.
Right. They're both nonprofit organizations in San Francisco. The Coalition on Homelessness has been around since the 80s here in San Francisco, and they basically work to advocate for policies to help homeless people with their rights and whatnot. That's always been kind of their narrative, right? But they are also very influential in San Francisco politics. Very influential. They drive some of the narrative here in San Francisco around homeless sweeps and whatnot, the term they use for sweeping the homeless. And so that's all I'm really going to say about them. I'm not looking to, go to the mat with anybody. I know who Jennifer Friedenbach is. I respect her. So she's been doing this a long time. The Dope Project is, it's a nonprofit that's funded through, it's like they're a spinoff of the Harm Reduction Coalition, and they're funded through the Department of Public Health. They get money from DPH to run all of the harm reduction policy pretty much in San Francisco. So when you go to those homeless hotels and you see all of the drug paraphernalia laid out, all the harm reduction services laid out in front of you in one of those hotels, all the pipes and the needles and all that stuff, that's all put there by the Dope Project. They're the ones that also funded the No Overdose campaign that had the people that looked like they were partying, before they did a bunch of drugs and whatnot. So they're the ones who I just quoted too, talking about that it wasn't the drugs that killed people, it was poverty and racism. And you could argue that there's an inkling of truth to that, but in the end, the bottom line is what's killing people really right now on the street is fentanyl. Period. That's what's killing people.
Right. So how can we balance the human rights of a single addict on the sidewalk versus the human rights of many people who may be passing by or residing in adjacent spaces?
Well, that's the argument, right? So, there's a term called maladaptive behavior. And that's, when you're a drug addict, you generally participate in maladaptive behavior unless you have, unlimited amounts of money to support your addiction. But if you're a guy like me that blew through all his money and ended up on the street homeless, yeah, I had to resort to maladaptive behavior in order to support my habit. And that's what got me in trouble. That's how I got arrested and I went to jail. And that's how I ended up getting clean, ironically, is because of that. So I think that there's a difference, being a drug addict it should not be criminalized, and being homeless should not be criminalized, but it's the actions that you take in your addiction that you have to be accountable for. And that's what I eventually had to own up to in recovery, is I had to face down, not just the criminal stuff that I did, but I had to face down the stuff I did to my wife and my kids and try to make amends for all that. And, learn how to forgive myself and then ask for forgiveness and, do all that stuff, all the stuff that's inside here, it's not just about getting healthy physically and getting off the drugs. It's about spiritual health. It's about mental health. There's a lot of different things that go into that in recovery. And, I would love to just wave a magic wand and say, okay, we're going to make all the drugs disappear and all these people are going to go into recovery, because they would be so much happier in recovery. Because right now we have literally thousands of people in San Francisco literally anchored to the streets because of drug addiction. And it's really sad for them, and it's also sad for the people that live here and pay taxes and are trying to raise families, that they have to, you know, their kids have to see that. They have to encounter that you have to explain to your child in a park, watch out, don't step on, watch out for needles, don't step on them, or watch out for that poop, don't step on it in the street. And that's not something that when I was growing up in San Francisco, we had to worry about. And even 15 years ago, I didn't have to worry about that in San Francisco.
Right.
But you have to worry about it now. When I walk down the street in the city, I walk with my head down, not because I'm ashamed of anything. I walk with my head down so that I don't step in poop. And that's really, to be factual, that's really the case.
Yeah, yeah. And look, the thing is, it doesn't feel as safe as it used to. You know, I think this next question is not really a fair question, but it does come up a lot, so I wanted to get your take on it. At what level do we kind of have to cut off San Francisco to outside newcomers coming in to consume services?
Well, you can't cut anybody off from coming here. It's a free country. So, you know, we can't close our borders or anything like that. That's not realistic for for someone to ask that. But what you can do, okay, is that so many people that come to San Francisco end up on general assistance in San Francisco. And general assistance is basically welfare for a single indigent male or female. And that money it's basically cash money up to $581 a month, plus $192 in food stamps, plus Medi-Cal, plus health insurance, okay, all for free, right? So you have up to 150 people a month transferring their general assistance case into San Francisco from another county in California. That means that there's 150 people at least coming here, walking into the general assistance office on 8th and Mission saying, hey, I'm on general assistance in Mendocino County, I want to transfer it here. And they transfer it here. And they can get, because they get more GA benefits here. San Francisco pays the most GA benefits of any county in California by at least $100 over everybody else, pretty much. And that's a big factor right there. So what you can do is that, hey, somebody maybe gets arrested 6 times like I did. After the 6th time, guess what? You can't get cash aid anymore. You can only get food stamps and Medi-Cal. That might drive some of the people to go elsewhere. And I think that's something they should consider.
Got it. Last question. What do you think is the biggest roadblock right now to making a significant impact on reducing this problem?
There's a ton of issues that I tried to answer that question on Twitter earlier today, and I think I came up with 4, and there's probably like 50 different issues. So, you know, it's the political climate. So there's no unity, there's no bipartisanship. It's, you know, the Board of Supervisors is primarily progressive leaning and the mayor is more of a moderate. So there's some division there. There's a terrible relationship, a really terrible relationship between the district attorney and the police department in San Francisco now. That's another issue with addressing it. The cops are arresting dealers and the DA is letting them out. They're prosecuting, but the outcomes in Superior Court are not the type of outcomes that you might expect to happen to someone that continuously gets arrested and sells fentanyl on the street in San Francisco. There's a huge bureaucracy in San Francisco. There's zoning problems. And then there's also the cost of living. It costs $600,000 to build 1 unit of housing, 1 unit of affordable housing in San Francisco. And then to create permanent supportive housing, it costs, you know, up to $300 million. And that's something that the mayor wants to do with some of that Prop C money, is they want to house, you know, up to 1,000 people with that money. But that's going to cost, you know, a few $100 million to do, plus the ongoing year-over-year maintenance costs of those permanent supportive housing units. So that's another issue. It's just, the bottom line is that we've got the money, but there's a lot of issues on how to spend it and who's in control of it. And the money itself is not necessarily infinite, while the homeless problem is not necessarily finite. It may never end.
That's a great quote to end on. Thomas, thank you so much. If you are on Twitter, Thomas is on twitter.com/mytwolffamily, mytwolffamily. I follow Thomas. I learn something new every week. And again, I don't have all the answers, but but I certainly want to hear your voices, and I want to continue on my journey of learning. Thomas, thank you so much. I've really learned a lot in this hour, and again, super appreciate your time. And I hope we can meet in person post-COVID, and I can, buy you lunch.
Thanks, John. I appreciate that. And it's my pleasure, man. And thank you to anyone who's out there listening to this. I just hope it makes you think.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.